This morning we're continuing a series that I only decided a day or so ago would become a series. If you were here last week, you will have known that we grappled with this idea of the fact that we live in God's story, right? We talked about the fact that we live in this overarching story, that there's only one story, right? The story of life, the story of the universe. It begins within the beginning, God created, and goes all the way through to Revelation when God concludes the story with a new heaven and new earth. And so we looked at this idea that we live in a story, and I was like, you know what? That's got legs on it. Let's go with a mini series called His Story. You like that? That was very last minute, so it wasn't too bad. And as part of last week wrestling with this idea that we live in God's story, we looked at how there are literary critics talk that there are certain things that have to be present to make a story, right? There are things like plot and characters and setting and theme that if they don't exist, then it's not a story. And one of the things that we added to that list is that you only have a story when you have an author. And who did we say is the author of the only story, the story of life that we live in? God. And we looked at the words of John Piper, who says this: the great tragedy of the world is that while God has written us into His story, right? That's the good news of the gospel, that God in this huge grand narrative of life has written us into that story of life. That's the good news. But he goes on to say, while God has written us into His story, we try to write Him into ours. And we looked at how the great deception that the devil has placed on the church in the 21st century in the West in particular is this idea, this thought that we can live in God's story and be the author. But guess what? We can't. And so here's the reality that we landed on, that we wrestled with. Every time we put our priorities first, every time we live with a vision of our bucket list and our hobbies and what we're doing, and we keep authoring that story, we keep writing that. Every time we write our own story, we write ourselves out of His story. And I hope last week you realized afresh that the moment we say Jesus is Lord, the moment that we give our life to follow Jesus is the moment that we actually commit to stop being the author of our own story and instead find our place in His story. Amen? Amen? Come on, you're going to need to be louder than that this morning. And one of the greatest challenges we face, I believe, is not just coming to that realization, not just finding our hearts compelled by that truth. No, one of the greatest challenges we face in thinking through the implications that that has for our life is actually putting pen to paper, right? Like, it's one thing to know a truth, but who knows, it's a very different thing to then live lives according to that truth. I know I should only eat one, sometimes two hamburgers for dinner. But I tell you, if they're good, I can be known to go back for thirds or fourths. Like, it's one thing to know a truth, it's another to live lives according to it. And so this morning I want to unpack a biblical principle that I think more than most things will have a profound impact in helping us live more intentionally as part of His story. Are you ready for this morning? A biblical principle that I want to look at this morning is the principle of stewardship. Everyone say stewardship. 3, 2, 1. Stewardship. Now, this is an interesting one, right? You see, stewardship is one of those topics that, despite actually being super prevalent in the Bible, actually kind of flies under the radar. Like, there are no epic stories to illustrate stewardship in the Bible like there are for David and Goliath, or Daniel and the lion's den, or like Moses with a staff parting the Red Sea. And so because of this, because it's not super glamorous, because it's not kind of in our face, we can often make the mistake of thinking that it either A, isn't in the Bible, or B, isn't that important. But what I hope you realize this morning is, man, it is. It's a little bit like this, right? Who's not heard of, right? Who's not heard of the brand Samsung? Put your hand up if you've not heard. Everyone's heard of this, right? And yet, catch this. No one most likely has ever heard of the brand Vizio, and yet this brand, year in, year out, sells more TVs than Samsung. Did you know that? What about this one? What brand is this? There's no doubt you own one of these, right? This is Netgear. It's the poster child of modem and routers, right? And yet, again, it's sold in many, many segments, far less considerably than the brand Zyzel. Now, I had to Google even how to pronounce this brand because, like you, I'd never heard of it. And so while the word steward or stewardship, here's a fun fact for you, only appears in the Bible 11 times, scholars say that as a principle, stewardship is described or it's addressed close to 1,000 times. Like, this is not something that can afford to be missed. In fact, the Bible begins with and frames the entire story to come on this very principle. Look at Genesis chapter 1. It says, and God blessed them, and God said to them. Now, just FYI, this is the very first thing that God ever says to humanity, right? I want you to catch this. This is significant. God has never talked directly yet to humanity, and yet here is his inaugural speech. What does he say? He says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Now that word subdue in Hebrew is the word kabash, and it's literally connected or comes out of the context of, you guessed it, stewardship. But he continues to say, he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over, which means take responsibility for the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on earth. I mean, at the very outset of the entire biblical narrative, humanity is literally introduced and entrusted in no uncertain terms as caretakers, as stewards. N.T. Wright, a famous biblical scholar, says this: the scriptural story makes it clear that humans are to act as stewards of creation, a role given to us right from the start. And all throughout the Bible, this principle is reinforced time and time again. Whether explicitly when Jesus teaches parables like the parable of the dishonest steward in Luke 16 or in the parable of the talents in Luke 19. The Bible also looks at this indirectly in stories and verses like ours today in Psalm 24. What did that say? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. I mean, if you read that verse in the light of the fact that we're in God's story and you come up with any vibes other than steward, caretaker, or, administrative servant, I think your comprehension needs a tune-up, right? It's pretty clear. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it and all who live in it. Peter writes to the early church the same message in 1 Peter 4:10. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful what? Stewards of God's grace in various forms. Paul then writes similarly to the churches that he's responsible for. This then is how you ought to regard us, okay? This is how you should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. I mean, you pay attention when you read the Bible, and you cannot escape the reality that all throughout the Bible, from cover to cover, it's blatantly on the pages that we are stewards and called to stewardship. Lauren Wilkinson writes this: to be human is to be a steward. This is the purpose and calling of all humanity. The Bible is unequivocally clear about this role. Christopher J.H. Wright also adds, the Bible unequivocally frames our human vocation as one of stewardship. This mandate is foundational to our understanding of our role in God's story. And so there's no question this morning that our role in God's story is that of steward. But I think there are two questions that for me come out of that must be addressed, and they're these. What even is a steward, right? What even is a steward, and how do we go about being a good one? Like, if our role is to be a steward, then what is a steward, and how do we go about being a good one? Well, the first question is pretty straightforward to answer. The Oxford Dictionary describes a steward like this: a person who administers anything as an agent of another. Say that again. A person who administers anything as the agent of another. And what that effectively means is that a steward is a person, I need you to catch this, I'm now quoting yours truly, a person is someone who uses someone else's resources, follow this, a steward is someone who uses someone else's resources to accomplish someone else's plans. I'll say that again. A steward is a person who uses someone else's resources to accomplish someone else's plans. I remember one of the very first jobs that I ever got as a young person was, any guesses? A nanny. I know, you didn't see that one coming, right? Especially because a lot of you know how I feel about small children. But praise the Lord, this was not being a nanny for small children. This, in fact, was being a nanny for 3 teenagers. And these weren't your ordinary teenagers. These were very dysfunctional teenagers because they grew up in what I can only describe as an incredibly affluent house. Like, mum and dad were killing it, and so there was just money popping out of every corner, nook and cranny in that house. And so because of their jobs, they were often away doing stuff, and so they needed a nanny to come and help run the house and look after the kids. And I got the job. And I remember when I got there, like, you got to imagine, this is like one of the nicest suburbs in the entire of Sydney, right? And it was like this 4-story mansion. It was an incredible house. It took me nearly like 6 minutes just to walk from one end of the house to the other. Like, this was a big house. It had this epic pool with a view over the Sydney Harbour. It had like jet skis parked out the front. There were these cool cars. And the thing that I remember that I don't know why particularly stuck out in my mind is when the dad was taking me on a tour of this house, he took me to the kitchen, right? The first kitchen. Then he took me to the second kitchen. And this, I'm sure he didn't call this. This is what I affectionately called the alcohol kitchen. Because you walked into this, and I kid you not, there were like 4 double-door fridges of just alcohol. There was one entire double-door fridge just for beer. Like Austrian beer, Belgian beer, Italy beer, Australian beer, Mexican beer, you name it, it was in there. Then there was like wine and gins. I was just like, I was blown away. And I remember having done just a couple of shifts in this role that the mum came to me at the end of the first week and she was like, are you going to stay? Are you going to stay? And I was like, yeah, I'll stay. She's like, you know, even in the shenanigans that happened yesterday when they stole your car. I was like, yeah, I forgot about that. What about when Trevor threw the shoe at you? Yeah, I've forgotten about that. Because what I didn't realize, and this is probably why I got the job, is they'd gone through 7 nannies in 7 weeks. No one had lasted more than a week. And so she thought there's no chance this bloke is going to stay around. And I tell you this, she just had no clue how broke I was as a uni student. I was like, man, I don't care, I'm staying here. And I remember just being blown away by all this stuff and all of this resources and things that was in this house. And I remember just thinking, yes, these kids are crazy, right? Full stop, these kids are crazy. But man, I get access to all sorts of stuff, right? I get access to jet skis, to cool cars, things that my 1980 falling apart Ford Laser could not compete with. And so I was like, heck yes, I'm going to stay. And I was thinking about that job, right? And while my title was nanny, which, isn't the best of names, particularly when you're like 20 to tell your bloke friends. Well, my title technically was nanny. You know what it really was? Steward. You're onto it. Steward. Like I was given access to all of these resources, but it was for the express purpose of looking after these people's kids, right? I used someone else's resources to accomplish someone else's plans. That's a steward. To make sure that those kids, were fed relatively healthy. To make sure that they were picked up on time. To make sure that, they did their homework or that they were properly exercised or properly entertained. That's why I got to use that resource for those purposes. And herein lies the answer to our second question of what makes a good steward. And it's simple. You ready for this? The degree to which that person is faithful in using what is entrusted to them for the plans and purposes of the one who entrusted it. Say it again. What makes a good steward is simply that that person is faithful in using what is entrusted to them for the plans and purposes of the one who entrusted it. Let me ask you a question. What do you think might have happened if I dropped the kids off, right, to school, went back to the house, texted all my uni mates and said, why don't you come and enjoy this epic house with me? Why don't we raid the alcohol fridges? Why don't we jump in the pool, take the jet skis for a burn? What do you think might have happened? What do you think might have happened if I took the money, the credit card that was given to me, right, to pay for dental procedures, to pay for physio appointments, and just went and bought new kicks? What do you think would happen? I'd be fired, right? I'd be fired. Because ultimately, all of this resource that I had access to for the plans and purposes of the one that had entrusted it to me. This is exactly what happened with the dishonest steward in Luke 16. Do you remember that parable? The dodgy steward? He was using what he had been entrusted in a way that was not faithful to his master's plans and purposes. And so he got fired, right? And what was Jesus' point in telling this parable? What was Jesus' point? Do you remember? It was simple. That we too are stewards. That we too are stewards. That all the resources we have, everything in life that we have access to, is for the express purpose of contributing to His story. That we too will be judged according to how faithful we are at using what God has entrusted to us to bring about His plans and His purposes. And I wonder if you've ever really stopped to think about that. I wonder if you've ever really caused your mind to consider that. That everything you have, right, from your car, your house, your bank balance, your health, your career, your time, your gifts, your personality, your passions, your influence, everything you have been given access to as a gift from God to steward in such a way that brings His kingdom or realizes His plans and purposes or works together for His story. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty challenging thought for me, right? Am I the only one? That's a pretty challenging thought. And it's challenging because most of the time I think we wander around life with the mindset of the world and with not the mindset of a steward, and they're different. You see, we live in a world and a culture where the prevailing mindset in life is that of ownership, right? That's the mindset, ownership. It's your life. It's your money. It's your time. It's your bucket list. It's your choice. It's your body. It's your freedom. Ultimately, it's your story. That's the mindset of the world that we live in. And yet the mindset of a steward isn't ownership. You know what it is? Oversight. Big difference. You see, a steward doesn't own anything, right? I didn't own any of those jet skis or cool cars or alcohol fridges. Praise Jesus. I didn't own any of them. What does the psalmist say? That the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And so here's the uncomfortable reality, and I can only assume you're so flipping quiet because it's uncomfortable. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Everything we have, you think about, you go through your list, everything we have, from our health to our house, to our job, to our influence, to the leadership we have, the money, the time that we use, is not ours. We do not own it. They're only things that we oversee. You know, King David learned this the hard way. And he learnt it the hard way in what has to be one of the most confusing stories in the Bible. And so if nothing else, I want to bring you some light this morning to a story that I reckon 95% chance you have no idea was about, and neither did I. And it's found in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. It says this: Then Satan rose up against Israel and caused David to take a census of the people of Israel. Do you remember this story? Do you remember thinking, Let's read it. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the army, "Take a census of all the people of Israel from Beersheba in the south to Dan in the north, and bring me a report so I may know how many there are." But Joab replied, "May the Lord increase the number of his people 100 times over. But why, my Lord?" Now, I just want to stop here, right? Anyone who knows Joab in the Bible knows this dude is a shady character. Like, every chance he gets, he's full of like war. He's full of anger. He's always like, let's just kill him. Let's just kind of bend the rules. Even Joab here, right, is saying to David, look at what he says. "But why, my lord the king, do you want me to do this? Are they not all your servants? Why must you cause Israel to sin?" Anytime, this is free, anytime you have non-Christians or other people in your world calling into question something that you might be doing, dude, that's a big wake-up call, right? And here is King David, so much more closer to God's heart, and Joab, this dude, the commander of his army, who honestly is questionable to say the best. He can even see that what David's about to do is not good. Verse 4. But the king insisted that they take a census. So Joab traveled throughout all Israel to count the people. Then he returned to Jerusalem and reported the number of people to David. There was 1.1 million warriors in all Israel who could handle a sword, and 470,000 in Judah. But Joab did not include the tribes of Levi and Benjamin, right? So this is only 10/12 of the number in the census, because he was so distressed. Again, I can't get over this. This is a guy, I'm probably going too hard on Joab, right? He's not bordering a pagan, but he is a questionable Christian, right? Here is a dude that is distressed, the word says. Distressed at what the king had made him do, which continues to fuel our curiosity of why. What's so wrong with this? We'll get to that. Verse 7. God was very displeased with the census, and he punished Israel for it. Then David said to God, "I have sinned greatly by taking this census. Please forgive my guilt for doing this foolish thing." So the Lord sent a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 people died as a result. Here's another freebie for you. Anytime you do persist, in one of those things that even God was using your work colleague or your neighbor or someone who isn't a God-fearing Christian to help convict you of? Anytime you persist in that, guess what? There will be collateral damage. Not just for you, but for those around you. There will be collateral damage. 70,000 people died as a result. Now, the great question we have with this story, right, is what's the big deal with taking a census, right? Is this not the thing that we're like, I don't get it. Why is it so bad? All he did was count a bunch of people. And we can throw little things like, oh, maybe he didn't trust God, or maybe he was trying to trust in his military might and things like that. Yeah, they're small reasons. But do you know what God's big issue about him taking the census was? It's the fact that in Exodus 30, verse 12, God actually prescribed a way to take a census. Right? So you were allowed to take a census. But God prescribed a way to take a census, and this is what he prescribed. Exodus 30, verse 12. He says, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them. Right? So David here defies God's clear instruction of how to take a census. But the deeper issue is this. It's not just that David defied God's instruction on how to take a census. It's actually understanding, why does God even prescribe this in the first place, right? That when you count people, right? When you count people, you need to pay me a ransom for every person that you count. Let me tell you. In the ancient Near East, when you counted something, right? When you counted something, guess what you declared? That you owned it. When you counted something, you were making the declaration that the only reason I'm counting this is because it's mine. And so God puts this prescription for Israel so that when they counted, when they did stuff, right, in amongst the culture that they lived in, that they would be reminded, their hearts would be reminded by paying God, by tithing him a ransom for every person that they counted, that ultimately this is not yours. You don't own this. I'm allowing you to count this, but you're a steward. And David doesn't do this. David gets so sucked in, so misled by the mindset of ownership that he forgets that ultimately he's an overseer. And I wonder this morning, are there areas in your life, or man, just throw that whole life in one big boom, that's probably me, where you go, if I'm honest, I think I'm treating this more like I own this than I oversee it. Maybe it's your bank balance. Maybe you've got clear financial goals that you're working toward. I'm going to pay this off. I'm going to do that. I'm going to buy this. I'm going to have that. I'm going to do this because this is all part of my story, right? Maybe it's your time. Maybe you're hesitant to give up your time for your neighbor or for one of the million ministries in this church that God is calling his local body to be a part of. And you've got sucked into this idea that the time is yours. You've been deceived, like I often am, by this mindset of ownership versus this mindset of overseeing. Maybe it's opportunities that have come your way, and you justify it by, oh, I don't think I'm really ready for that, or, oh, I'm not sure about this. Or you jump in and you begin to use it and leverage it for your story. And God said, hang on, I gave you this opportunity for my story. I gave you that gift so you would steward it as part of my story. I gave you that neighbor I gave you that relationship. I gave you that time. I gave you that resource so that you would steward it for my story. And this is the great challenge of this text, that ultimately our role is not of owner. Our role is overseer. You know, I remember, you ever done something where you kind of look back on it and go, that really could have gone badly? You know what I'm talking about? Like, you don't realize it in the time, of course, or you wouldn't do it. But you look back and go, only one tiny thing had to go wrong there, and oh my gosh, that would have ruined my life. I remember when we were getting married, Bianca and I, we had saved this money for a house. We'd managed to save 50 grand, which honestly 20 years ago for like 2 young kids was a lot of money. And my dad will always say that money burns a hole in your pocket, Matt. And what he means by that is I get restless. Now, I used to get restless with spending it, but as I got older, I'd get restless with investing it. And I sat there and I remember, right, this is the worst part. We had signed a contract on our house, right? We had a settlement date. Our signatures were on that bit of paper. And I remember one night looking at that $50,000. I'd never seen money like that in my life. And I remember looking at that money going, it's accruing 1.13% interest. That's terrible. And it's going to sit there. And for me, it felt like forever. It was 3 months. I was like, it's going to sit there for 3 months. What a waste of just letting this huge chunk of money sit there and accrue 1.13% interest. So you know what I did? This is not good. This is not financial advice, just so you know. It's probably not advice at all. I bought shares. $50,000 worth of shares. Now, to make matters worse, this is where it gets funky. I knew nothing about shares. I literally didn't know a single thing about how it worked. I didn't even know how you bought them. I had to watch all these YouTube videos just to set up an account. And in the end, I too found this later out that I'd set it up wrong and almost got in tax trouble because I'd set it up wrong. But I managed to buy these shares. I had one friend that I knew, right, that earned a killing on shares. I was like, yeah, man, I'm buying shares. And so I put our entire house deposit that we had committed to the bank, right? Binding legal contract to give them $50,000 in just 3 months' time. And I bought $50,000 worth of shares. And here's the worst part. I'm a risk taker, right? I'm like, go hard or go home. So I didn't buy what they call blue chip shares, you know, Commonwealth Bank, ANZ, something that's very safe that for the last 100 years has just kept going up. No, I found this company that in the prior week to me buying $50,000 worth of shares had lost 50% of value. Because in my head, I was like, well, they've already lost 50% of value. Surely they'll just go up. Turns out, I learned this too. Turns out that something like 99% of companies that lose 50% of value in their shares in a week actually end up going bankrupt. But I didn't know this. So I bought all these shares. One of the things, and, you know, I will say just this. Praise God that even in my foolishness, those shares actually went up and I made a small killing. And so God protected me. But one of the things that I realized in this whole venture was what it meant to be a shareholder. I don't know if you've ever been a shareholder, but if you're a shareholder of particular companies, that comes with some pretty good perks, can I just say? And I didn't know any of these perks until one day I'm sitting there and all of a sudden I get this check of extra money that I wasn't counting on. See, I was expecting the global price of the share hopefully to go up. I knew that's how you made money. I'd never heard of dividends. Dividends, praise Jesus, extra money. And so I'm getting these dividends. I was like, what the heck? I remember going on a flight and getting welcomed into this lounge, this first class lounge, because now I was a shareholder and that meant I got this and I could do that. I remember getting invitations to vote on constitutions and governances and all this stuff, and I just picked C. Who knows what on earth they were talking about. But I remember, right? I got lured and I enjoyed this life of what it meant to be a shareholder. I got control. I got perks. I got profits. And this is all I want to leave you with this morning. God has called us to be stewards, not shareholders. That our role, take it up with Him. Because here's the point. Whether you engage with His story or not, that story's got a conclusion, right? Whether you want to deny the existence of the author, whether you want to complain about the role that you've got, the part that you play, here's the reality. He's called us to a very specific role, and that role is stewards, not shareholders. And I wonder this morning, as you bow your heads and close your eyes, what is it that God is speaking right now into your heart? That He would say, you're treating this like you're a shareholder, Matt. You're treating that area like a shareholder, Jenny. You're treating that area like a shareholder, Katrina. You're treating that area like a shareholder, Greg. But you're my steward. Everything I have given you access to, everything I have entrusted to you, I have done so for the express purpose of you using it to work out my plans and purposes. And so I just want us to wrestle with the revelation of that this morning. That we are stewards, we are not shareholders. That we will have an account, be judged on how faithful we were at realizing God's plans and purposes with everything He entrusted to us. And it's so much bigger than just your bank balance. It's creation itself. What are your thoughts about the environment? Forget politics. You are entrusted to look after God's creation. It's bigger than just money. It's your time. Every day that you breathe, you think this is in your control, that you get to map out your life. At any moment, that life can be snuffed from you. At any moment. Every day that you're being given is another allowance that God entrusts you and expects and holds you responsible to using it for His plans and purposes. It's your career. It's your gifts. It's your talents. It's the opportunities. It's the whole of life. So my simple prayer this morning, God, would you help us to be stewards and not shareholders? Would you help us, Holy Spirit, by your revelation, to realize that everything we have, that everything you've entrusted to us, you've done so for the express purpose that we would contribute to your story and not go about trying to write our own. God, let us catch a hold of this deep truth that we are stewards, not shareholders.